Welcome. My name is Katie Hoerth, and this is the Poetry Society of Texas podcast. In this show, we will discuss an award-winning book of poetry with its author. Our guest today is the Edwin M. Eakin Memorial Award winner, Dr. Charlotte Renk. After completing her PhD from Louisiana State University and teaching there for 5 years, Charlotte moved to Athens, Texas, and found inspiration for poetry and stories that came from long walks in the woods behind her East Texas cabin, and from reflections accumulated over many years while teaching English, humanities, and creative writing at Trinity Valley Community College. She's won numerous poetry awards, has had her work published in the wealth of anthologies, and her latest work, which will be the topic of a future podcast, The Great Turtle Heart, The Tao of Turtleism, won the 2017 Catherine K. Sloop Manuscript Prize. Tonight, we'll be discussing Charlotte's book, These Holy Hungers. Welcome, Charlotte.
Well, thank you, Katie, and thank you, Terry. This is such an honor.
Thanks. I'm so glad to have this opportunity to talk to you, Charlotte, about your book tonight. So can you tell us a little bit about where you got your inspiration for this particular book of poems, These Holy Hungers?
Well, yes. First of all, it stems from experience. And my view is that I wanted to hold life up to the light so that I might learn from these various experiences. I wanted to try to turn adversity into truth or wisdom or transform it. So I wanted to do that with the experience of it, the themes of it, and then I was trying to include the musicality and poignance of some of my favorite writers, T.S. Eliot, Robert Frost's dramatic dialogues, Louise Glick, and W.S. Merwin are inspirations because they can turn experience into art, and Merwin is a mystic whom I admire immensely.
Oh, yeah, I definitely can feel kind of Merwin channeled in your work, Charlotte. And certainly Robert Frost, too, with his kind of connection with nature imagery. I see a lot of that in These Holy Hungers. You had mentioned that there was kind of a theme into your book about adversity. Can you talk a little bit more about that theme and how it comes together in this collection?
Childhood experiences were rather difficult. We were poor. There was a great deal of conflict. My dad was pretty tough on all of the 10 of us in that 4-room household. So it was tough growing up and overcoming some of the conflict. So I really wanted to explore some of those things and look at them, to hold them up to the light and see what I can make of them. So for the book, I was looking for threads that existed in my experience.
And it's almost like you're creating art from that adversity, right? And you're finding kind of these moments of light amongst the darkness. That's really wonderful. You had wanted to read a poem for us today, or I hope you will. So can you please tell us a little bit about the poem you'll share with us?
Yes, the poem that I would most like to read occurs early in the book, and it's called The Rhythm of Rice. And it is about a universal hunger. Also, in my efforts to make art out of life, I really wanted to include musicality and poignance and metaphors. And so I call it The Rhythm of Rice, and rice is the primary metaphor in the poem. And Myanmar had just experienced severe flooding, and I was very concerned about that. And I saw an image on television, actually, of a father walking with his son who had been killed in that flood, and a mother grieving. And as a mother, I can't even imagine anything worse than losing a child. So I created The Rhythm of Rice. I wore it for many days, and then I wrote it.
Wow. And would you read that for us now, Charlotte?
I would be delighted to. The Rhythm of Rice. Sorrow spills onto the floor, not like milk single splat and white spread, not like syrup, sticky melancholy, oozing black, nor even olive oils, slippery, sheening. Rather like raw rice, spilling uncontainable from its ripped sack, splattering staccato across the countertop, across the floor, its rhythm unrecognizable according to some physical law I cannot comprehend. So as I bend to retrieve rice, tracing tile like braille, its crevices, bumps, corners, unwilling to miss a grain, I wonder how much rice it takes to fill the holes of the living undead father who lifts limp the broken body of his boy, neck swinging and bobbing from the crook of his arm as he trudges toward the gaping mouth of his wife, who stops wailing then to stare, silent, beyond despair, at some physical law she cannot comprehend. What rice draws four fingers to the warm bowl to scoop life into the mouths undead and unliving? What hunger opens lips to wrap around spoons to pull life in, to press it against an untasting tongue, to chew it without will? How does one swallow loss? What force washes the wave, slides the mountain down, slits the slender throat, rapes the wide eyes that cannot apprehend?
Wow, Charlotte, that was truly amazing. Thank you so much for sharing that with us. So could you talk a little bit about, so the poem is about rice, right? And that's kind of the vehicle of the metaphor, but it opens up to be about so much more than just spilling rice, on the kitchen countertops, right? Turns into this exploration of the abstract of grief, right? So could you talk a little bit about more maybe what's behind the poem or about your process for writing it?
Well, yes, the questions of evil and suffering in the world plagued me at the time I was writing it, about how dreadful things can happen to people. And, I went on to write in that poem, source does not matter, why does not matter, neither does how, only the is counts now, like rice spilling random from the ripped sack. I wanted to know, how people live with grief and loss and sorrow. And so that poem is the upshot of that exploration. It's the philosophical exploration of evil and how people cope with it. Not evil in men's deeds, but random acts.
Yeah. And I pulled out one line that I found particularly powerful in your poem, Charlotte, aside from all of the, the really sensory details, alliteration that's in your work, kind of the musicality of the piece. But there's this one question that just stood out to me as a reader of your poem, and it's, how does one swallow loss, right? And I think that kind of the big question that pushes your poem, it's a question that I think only poetry can answer. Would you like to read another poem for us today?
I really would, and I appreciate your asking, because that other poem, The Rhythm of Rice, is of universal sorrow. But because my book is called These Holy Hungers, Secret Yearnings from an Empty Cup, I have another poem that is called Knock and the Door Shall, which of course is an allusion to a biblical passage, that follows, knock and the door shall be opened. And this poem is a kind of jazzy poem that is the outgrowth of a yearning within a young woman to know God or to know Jesus. And she has a really primal misunderstanding about where God is and Jesus is. And yet it's an exploration. And then there is a flashback to my grandmother and experiences I had growing up. And so this poem, I think, achieves a kind of universality by our questing to understand spirituality, our need for spirituality in our lives.
Awesome. I'd love to hear it, Charlotte.
Knock and the door shall. Like a Jesus eye peeking through a peephole, you see her. She's standing there, half naked, round bubbled, pounding on the door, bouncing up and down, flapping unwings and side straddle hops, and looking ridiculous. She's doing this in her pink bra and panties, for crying out loud, trying to get Jesus to let her into his Hilton suite so they can sip Zen and green tea, burn a little patchouli, and listen to Ellington duking it out with Hooker and Joplin. She gulps syncopation every chance she can, and to do it with the man would be wild. Now, her friend Z's been gone to Burleson too long, and she's got to talk to somebody. She don't really gulp syncopation. She sips it like smooth hot crown in a mug. Mugs make her feel down home, kind of aw shucks instead of bootylicious, which she wouldn't have said in front of her grandma or Jesus. Mugs remind her of a rough-hewn old table for 10, benches flanking both sides and ends. Grandma used to ask her to pass things like potatoes or peppers, saying, "Thanks for the pepper," or whatever, which was a funny way of getting what she was after. Grandma had faith, but she's been gone longer than Z. The girl wishes he'd unlock the door, unzip her brows, and caress the thoughts throbbing and lighting bad places in her brain. This little queen of belief has been dethroned by Katrina and a couple of blows to the belly, and since she can't unzip her brows, she'd like to rip her heart out, set it in the man's hand so he could rub it till it beats normal again. You know how it is alone. Mugs don't hold enough crown or tea to live on. So, hey, she says, "Thanks for opening the door, Jay."
Wow. A holy hunger, right? From these holy hungers. That was fantastic. So, Charlotte, what would be your advice to someone who is new to poetry? What advice would you give someone who's maybe struggling with finding ideas or inspiration to write about?
Well, it would be a kind of 3-step process. I would advise the new writer to observe very closely and carefully and select the details that are intriguing about that observation. Then I would advise the writer to do what is called capture, to capture those ideas by jotting them down for later. If that writer cannot sit down and write it out right then and there, capturing is very important for creativity. Making notes, keeping journals, even writing down 2 or 3 images or words or statements they hear. And then finally, I would draw from Einstein's recommendation about combinatory play, where you combine words and images, and that is the way, by taking a combination of old and new ideas, putting them together, old and new words, and combinatory play. The creative writer likes to play with the language, and that's what I would recommend. Observe, capture, and combine.
Yeah, I love that for you, Charlotte, that a lot of writing, it can be playful, right? And it can be fun. And sometimes through that playfulness, maybe that's where these unexpected kind of combinations or these unexpected ideas come from.
Absolutely.
So you've been very much involved with the Poetry Society of Texas. And so I wanted to ask you, how important do you think it is for poets to participate in a poetry community like the Poetry Society of Texas?
2 major benefits come from being involved in a poetry community, Katie. One is the monumental support that a person gets in a community, of poets who love poetry and who support the effort to create it. So that sense of support from the community. And secondly, and I think even most importantly, is the critique. It is so important to learn from our colleagues and be always open to revision and rethinking our poems. And if there are questions, to be able to address those questions and solve those problems.
Yeah, we can certainly learn from one another. And poetry community is a way that we can maybe not feel so isolated and alone with writing, right?
Absolutely.
So thank you so much, Charlotte, for all of your insight today and for sharing your fantastic poems with us, the Poetry Society podcast. This has been a Poetry Society of Texas podcast featuring Dr. Charlotte Renk. This show is sponsored by the Poetry Society of Texas, whose website is poetrysocietyoftexas.org. The podcast producer is Terry Jude Miller, and music is provided by Ed and Mim Frida. Technical and editing services are provided by JDarrell Kirkley. And I'm your host, Katie Hoerth. Thanks so much.